Hi, my name is Elizabeth Dale-Deines, and I'm really grateful that you've joined us today with Teachers Making Black Arts History. We are going to be looking at A Bold and Beautiful Vision, which is an exhibition at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. It explores a rich history of African-American artists, educators in Washington, D.C. across the 20th century. It's an exhibition that celebrates the collective genius of community, including teachers, mentors, and students who made the city into an unparalleled center for Black arts education and also produced some of the country's most gifted artists. Samir Meghelli, who's here with me, and I'm an educator. We are going to be looking at all of this inspiring education stories and then thinking about how that helps us see our community's strengths today. And like I mentioned, I'm Elizabeth Dale-Deines. I'm the education specialist at the Office of the Undersecretary for Education, and I am joined by...
Hi, everyone. I'm Samir Meghelli. I'm the senior curator at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum, and curator of this exhibition will be talking about A Bold and Beautiful Vision.
Gorgeous. And we just wanted to be like really plain up front so you know what to expect. We've got 5 sort of thematic chapters, and what we hope you'll notice in each of those thematic chapters is that Samir is going to speak from the position of a curator, talk about this incredible exhibition, and look for ways to sort of start unpacking ideas for you. As he goes, I'm going to challenge you to listen for evidence of 3 of the skills that we identified as being really valuable in both the museum context, in the classroom context, and out in the world. And those 3 skills are research, collaboration, and storytelling. And you'll also notice, hopefully, that those should be immediately transferable. We'll pose a couple of rhetorical questions throughout, and we'll pause very briefly for those, but just to kind of help you start sparking some thinking about how you might bring this into your classroom space. And as you go, we hope you'll pop some questions into the chat. So then, to get us started with chapter 1, knowing that each one highlights a little different theme. Samir, what is the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum?
Yeah, so this is our building today. We're located in Southeast Washington, D.C., in a neighborhood called Anacostia. We're actually the Smithsonian's only community-based and locally focused museum of the institution's 20-plus museums. As you can see in these maps, a good majority of the museums are on the National Mall there on the top left. And in the bottom right, you can see where we are in relation to the National Mall. So we're located east of the Anacostia River in a neighborhood called Anacostia. And the Anacostia River historically has been a kind of dividing line or barrier socioeconomically, racially, and otherwise in the city for much of its history. And so we're very much shaped by that history, and the work that we do is as well. We were established in 1967 by the Smithsonian. This is actually a photo of our first site, our first location, which we were located in what was the old Carver Theater, and the historic Carver Theater on what's now called Martin Luther King Jr. Avenue. And our founding director, John Kennard, was a native of Anacostia, had a rich background as a community organizer, and believed deeply in this idea that museums could and should work closely and collaboratively with local communities to ensure that the institutions reflected and met the needs and interests of their local neighborhoods. And so you can see on the bottom right, members of what was then a newly created Anacostia Historical Society in the late 60s, early 70s, giving some sense of the degree to which the museum was really driven by local community members.
So then, with that context, what can you tell us about A Bold and Beautiful Vision?
Yeah, so this exhibition, I would say, very much in the tradition of our museum's work, our community-centered work, wanted to highlight and celebrate the rich and I would say largely overlooked tradition and lineage of African-American artist educators in Washington across the 20th century. Um, so many now celebrated artists had been students in Washington, or had been teachers in Washington, or in some cases had been both a student and a teacher in Washington. And so we really wanted to shine a light on that history, and really place these artists in context and in the communities that helped produce them. And so that's what this exhibition really is seeking to do. Um, just to give a few examples of artists who are featured in the exhibition who have deep roots in Washington. There's Alma Thomas, who is a very now celebrated abstract artist who graduated from DC's Armstrong High School and then Howard University, and then became a longtime art teacher, Shaw Junior High School here in Washington, DC. Elizabeth Catlett, the renowned printmaker and sculptor, was a graduate of the DC Public Schools, Dunbar High School, which we'll talk a bit more about in a moment. Also a graduate of Howard University, and had a long career as a teacher and mentor. James A. Porter, widely considered the founder of the field of African-American art history, was a graduate of DC Public Schools and a graduate of Howard University, and taught there for many decades. Lois Mailou Jones taught at Howard University for many years. Malkia Roberts was a graduate of the DC Public Schools and Howard University, and then taught in the DC Public Schools, art in the DC Public Schools for many years. Sam Gilliam, the celebrated abstract artist, when he first came to Washington in the 1960s, was a DC public school teacher. And Georgette Seabrook Powell, one of the very early Works Progress Administration artists from the 1930s, was a longtime arts advocate and art teacher in Washington. Duke Ellington, the famed jazz musician, was a graduate of DC Public Schools. Billy Taylor, the renowned jazz pianist and educator, was a graduate of DC Public Schools. So in asking the question, who were the teachers and mentors of those artists and musicians, and in turn, whose artistic skills and careers did they help cultivate as mentors or as teachers? We really revealed a rich tapestry of relationships throughout the exhibition. There are these kinds of what I almost think of as family trees that begin to show some of the relationships, so that you can see at the very top there, the top row, were some of the very early teachers in Washington, lines connecting them to some of the institutions that they taught at, and beneath that, some of the students who studied under them at those various institutions. And so the exhibition really is trying to highlight and celebrate those rich intergenerational relationships that made Washington, I think, an unparalleled center for arts education.
There are so many incredible people in this exhibition, and I know that being able to move from the building context to sort of this rich overview, there's a lot to dig into, and I'm really curious, where are we going to begin?
So the exhibition begins really at the dawn of arts education in DC, at a time when the city newly created segregated school system. So it was in 1862 local legislation that was passed that allowed for the creation of a dual race-based school system in DC, where there had been a school system for white students in Washington since the first decade of the 1800s. It wasn't until the 1860s that there was a parallel for African American students. And so we begin the exhibition talking about that early history of the beginnings of art education. And in particular, you walk into the exhibition and you're hopefully transported into almost a turn of the century art classroom. And as you enter, you're confronted by this quote from the celebrated artist, Alma Thomas, again, who had been a teacher for many years in the DC Public Schools, where she, through this quote is talking about the power, the transformative power of her time at Armstrong High School, which was the second high school for African-American students that was established in Washington, D.C. And she, went on to say that her time at Armstrong High School as in studying art there really laid the foundation for her life. And so honoring that idea of the transformative power of arts education in DC public schools, I'm really using that as a point of entry into a deeper dive into some of the people and institutions that really laid the foundation. The three institutions that are really critical in this history were there you see in the middle, Dunbar High School, or what was before that known as M Street High School, which was actually the first public high school for African-American students anywhere in the nation. And because it drew faculty from across the nation and in turn produced national leaders in the fields of medicine, politics, science, and of course the arts. There on the left is Armstrong Manual Training School, or what later becomes known as Armstrong High School, which was established in 1902 as the second high school for African American students in Washington, D.C. And on the right, you see the Minor Normal School, or Minor Teachers College, as it was later known, which was the teacher training school for African American students, aspiring teachers in D.C. And each of these three institutions educated generations of artists and art educators in Washington, D.C. And so as you enter the exhibition, you come across this recreation of a turn of the century teacher's desk that people can sit down at and explore. But it really helps us begin to tell the story of a totally forgotten, but really foundational art educator in Washington named Thomas Hunster, who was born into a free Black family in the state of Ohio in 1851 and moved to Washington, D.C. in the 1870s in hopes of being able to make enough money to travel to Paris to study art. He remained in Washington actually for the entirety of his career and was hired in the 1870s by the superintendent of the what was then called the Colored Division of the DC Public School System, the division that served African American students. He was hired to develop the art curriculum. And he did really from scratch develop the art curriculum, but it was an incredibly innovative and forward-thinking art curriculum, so much so that it ended up being adopted district-wide some years after he had developed it. So it was the curriculum that students in both the white schools and African American schools were learning from. He taught at the M Street High School or Dunbar High School. He taught at Minor Teachers College and really had a huge impact on arts education in Washington, D.C., having personally taught some of the people we've already mentioned, like Alma Thomas, among many others. One of the paintings we have on display in the exhibition is this landscape painting from circa 1900. And you can see it in the context of the exhibition, where alongside this quote from one of his contemporaries who said that he really made an invaluable contribution to public education in DC, but he had been entirely forgotten. So we wanted to really dig into his story, provide some context for his incredibly important role in arts education in Washington, D.C. And just one example that I can share here, in addition to that which I've already shared, is that he was commissioned or asked to develop some artwork to be displayed at the 1900 World's Fair in Paris, France. And he chose to collaborate with his students to develop a series of dioramas, which you can see in a not so great photo on the right side of your screen. Dioramas retracing the history of African Americans from the era of enslavement through the creation of the modern brick schoolhouse. And those dioramas are small-scale scenes that he created with his students, traveled to Paris, France, where they were on view for millions to see, and really just speak to his deep belief in and commitment to the idea of the limitless potential that he saw in his students, and this was at the peak of segregation. And so, um, W.E.B. Du Bois, the renowned scholar and activist, also exhibited at the 1900s World's Fair in Paris, France, and alongside the work of Thomas Hunster and his students, and remarked on how striking the work that they had on display was. So that's just one sort of little insight into how remarkable the work of Thomas Hunster was.
So this is fascinating to me because we have a teacher artist who is a huge advocate, such a huge advocate for his students' work. And basically his story and influence had been largely forgotten. And so you, as a historian, had some work to do in order to uncover his stories and other stories like his in this exhibition. So I'm curious, would you tell us a little bit, where do you go for stories? Where do you go for photos, information, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many avenues to pursue, but there are a couple in particular which I'll share here. Um, one really important source. I mean, maybe I'll start by saying that we had we had several paintings by him in our collection for actually 40 plus years that had been donated by one of his students, William Buckner, who was also an art educator and principal in the DC public schools for many years. But the works themselves had not really been thoroughly researched, and only in the past couple of years had Thomas Hunster himself, the creator of those artworks, begun to be researched. And so we did have to, in many ways, start from scratch, although it's important to point out that there was one really great scholarly article that had been written by scholar artist Pamela Harris Lawton that we were able to rely upon for some background information and the great research that she did, but we were also able to do additional research. And so one of the sources that we went to were historical newspapers. And these can be a really incredible resource for getting all kinds of details about any community's history, whether that be a city, a neighborhood, a school community. And often you can get access freely through your local library to a number of databases that have digitized historical newspapers. And so we were able to do that. And I would say especially historic African-American newspapers have been an underutilized source. And so we were able to go to newspapers like the Washington Bee, which was a relatively short-lived but widely read at the time, at the turn of the century in the late 1800s and early 1900s in Washington, African-American newspaper. And there were others later on, like the Afro-American, which was based out of Baltimore, Maryland, but which had editions in a few different cities. And so there were newspapers like that documented really everyday life of the community. And so we were able to, through searching that database, find articles about Thomas Hunster, about the work that he was doing in the DC public schools. So that was one really helpful source, was newspapers. One other one was actually oral histories, which we're a big advocate for, doing oral histories for a variety of reasons, but they can often uncover history that isn't otherwise documented in written sources. And so in this case, we actually interviewed the scholar artist Pamela Harris Lawton, who happens to also be a fifth generation Washingtonian educator, who grew up seeing a painting by Thomas Hunster of, if I'm remembering correctly, her great grandmother hanging in her family home. And so it was through stories, through being able to interview her and others, hearing about stories of Thomas Hunster, really helped fill out the picture of who he was and his importance and significance in Washington. And so between the newspapers and oral history interviews, those are just two examples of some of the sources that we went to really try to uncover more about who he was and his impact.
That's so powerful. And I think one of the things that comes to mind is something that you had shared with me that as I pose this rhetorical question to teachers, I'm just going to front load it with this beautiful and to me, very profound statement that you made about where you look dictates the stories that you're able to find and tell. And so, challenging teachers in the room, or if you're an out-of-school educator or anything else, please consider how this might apply to the folks that you mentor. Where would they go first, second, or third to find resources? And actually, you've provided us with a bunch. And so I just wanted to ping for you in the audience that all of these links that Samir has provided to us are in a Learning Lab collection that is going to be linked at the end of the session. Before we go on though, Samir, I want to just pose a question that came up while you were talking about Dunbar, Armstrong, and Minor. Someone in the audience was curious about whether those buildings are still standing, and if so, what are they used for today?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually varies. So the Minor Teachers College building is actually still standing. It's on the campus of Howard University, although the building itself is currently closed and undergoing renovation. It's part of an effort to really restore that building and its history to its proper place. The original Dunbar building, I believe, is no longer there. I could be mistaken about that. And the Armstrong building, at least one iteration of it, is still standing, and it's a charter school today. So there is some of that architectural history that's still present and today.
That's such another interesting to me source anyway, the idea that architecture could be a place to look. Okay, so throughout our time together, there will be this little peppering of sources, and so just keep an eye out for that, knowing that it's going to be linked. But we're on to chapter 3, which is about community and collaboration, and you work at a community museum, and so I'm really excited to hear about what role the community played in Black arts history and how you represent them in the exhibition.
Yeah, so I think really at the center of our curatorial and storytelling practice is this idea that community is at the foundation of kind of every story. And so I can share a story of an organization that I think exemplifies this in the case of DC. And it was a youth arts organization called the New Thing Art and Architecture Center, which was established in 1966 and 67 in a neighborhood in Washington called Adams Morgan. And really what was so important and distinctive about it was that it was the product of just a really incredible group of artists who were dedicated to this idea of providing access and training in the arts to young people, beginning at a very early age. And so just to give you a sense of the range of kinds of people and artists that were involved, there you can see at top in the center, the founder and director of the organization, Topper Carew, who had been a student at Howard University and a member of the civil rights organization called SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And all around him, you see a range of artists, some of whom had been fellow Howard students, like to his immediate, to our right, to the right of him, Melvin Deal, to the left of him. Melvin Deal taught African drum and dance in Washington, D.C. for more than a half century, was a graduate of Howard University and a native of D.C. To Topper Carew's left was Lou Stovall, who was also a graduate of Howard University and ran a printmaking workshop in Washington, D.C. He was a master printmaker and mentored generations of artists, particularly through his workshop. To his left was Percy Martin, who taught art in Washington, D.C. for many years. Beneath him is Eric Gravatt, a percussionist who went on to have a remarkable career in jazz as a percussionist for McCoy Tyner and the group The Weather Report. So each one of these artists, before they became well known in their respective fields, um, came to the new thing and taught art to young people, and just really um, illustrates the extent to which it was the coming together of this community of people that made the organization's work possible. Um, they taught photography, and so here you can see some images of the young people that they were teaching photography to. Um, they taught painting and drawing. They taught filmmaking. They taught, as I mentioned, African drum and dance, particularly under the leadership of Melvin Deal. And they were producing art throughout that, throughout all of that work. And so three of the works that we have on display in the exhibition are these posters, which Lloyd McNeil, who taught painting and drawing, but was also the first MFA graduate from Howard University's art department, and his collaborator Lou Stovall, who I already mentioned, they created these silkscreen posters for the weekly concert series that the New Thing Art and Architecture Center curated. And the idea was every week they were bringing luminaries from around the country to put on an almost free concert. They charged $1 for adults and 35 cents for kids, really to make it accessible. And it was a place where artists could really experiment. It was called the New Thing Jazz Workshop. It wasn't just jazz, although it was primarily jazz. And then it wasn't actually a workshop. It was more of a concert, but it was a space where, again, the musicians could experiment in a safe space. And so this is some of the work that the New Thing Art and Architecture produced, and really captures kind of the aesthetics of that organization. So for the, I would say that the relatively short-lived existence of this organization, it was founded in around 1966, 67, and slowly kind of petered out around 1974. But during that relatively short-lived period, the organization actually did transform the cultural landscape of the city, and really helped cultivate a generation of artists who went on to do really incredible things, not just in Washington, but far beyond.
This was a very invested community. We have this community of teachers, we have a community of artists, we have the community that came to the workshops that weren't workshops, we have the children community. I mean, this is like layers upon layers upon layers of community, and working together to create something that served a need, which I think is really powerful. And that's also reflected in your own practice as a curator. You actually collaborate with the community. And I'm curious to know a little bit about how you document, preserve, and then tell the story of different community members collaboratively.
Yeah, well, again, I think this goes back to our long-standing tradition at the museum of really seeing community at the center of every story. And so we see community as the authority. You know, we don't necessarily see ourselves as the authority. We're going to community to collaborate with them to really help document, preserve, and share their stories. And so that permeates all aspects of the process of our exhibition development. And so just some examples of the ways that we do this in our process is, I mentioned one already, of oral history interviews. And so this is really critical because, one, it helps build relationships with community members. It also is critical to the documenting of community history, since so much of community history exists in the memories and the collective memory of the community. Being able to document that through oral history is really important. It also builds a sense of investment in the work that we're doing when we're able to help community members understand, in the case that they don't yet have an appreciation of how significant and important their stories are, And I think that's really critical too. Um, and then oral histories actually shape what ends up on the walls in the exhibition, so that the stories that we're telling aren't from the perspective of the museum staff. It's actually from the perspective of the community members themselves. And so, just as an example, in this exhibition, as you walk throughout, in each section, you can see, filmed oral histories that we did. So you're seeing the faces of the artist educators that are in the exhibition. You're hearing the voices and the stories as well. So oral history is one really critical part of the process. Another is, hosting community forums where we bring together community members around a particular facet of the topic that we're working on for a forthcoming exhibition, which helps cultivate the museum space as kind of like a meaningful site for conversation and dialogue. And it also becomes a way to surface perspectives on that history that can help shape what ends up in the narrative, in the exhibition, in the work that we're doing. And we also do community collecting. And so working with community to identify, it could be family heirlooms, it could be, important or not so important, seemingly at least, everyday objects from community life. Could be artwork. And so being able to work with community members to identify what those may be and ensure that we can preserve them and exhibit them or display them so that the community as a whole can, that they can be shared with the community as a whole. And so those are some of the ways that we work to ensure that the work that we're doing is deeply community collaborative and shaped deeply by the community itself.
To me, it's so amazing to think of the many different ways that we can ask questions of one another, and the opportunities that we might provide to youth to ask questions of their elders. So thinking about today as a product of events and decisions made in the past, though community members that surround our students can be ways to make sense of what is happening today, because there's an understanding of what happened in the past, which I think is really beautiful. And then really you unpacked these artworks, the artworks that that are up in the exhibition are contextualized, and there's just layers and layers and layers of rich history surrounding them. So thinking about the ways the teachers in this session might use artworks as a way to make sense of history or get students excited about history is really interesting. Before we go ahead though, I have a question from a local DC area teacher who's curious about field trips or educational programs that you provide at ACM. Can you speak a little about that?
Yeah, sure. So we definitely are happy to host groups, school groups at the museum, and can either provide the materials for a self-guided tour, or in some instances we're happy to provide a curator-led tour or a staff-led tour. And then there's a page on our website at anacostia.si.edu where you can see all the educational materials related to the exhibition. So you can see the videos that we produced that are featured in the exhibition. There's an exhibition booklet that has a good amount of the content from the exhibition. And then there's an educator resource guide that provides some kind of guided thinking around the exhibition for teachers and their students, or educators and their young people. So there's hopefully a wealth of material that we are making available online, but also are always happy to host groups as well.
Thank you. Shall we go on to chapter 4?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. Okay, so we have this lineage. You mentioned like a family tree earlier with the yellow slide with all the circles on it. But to me, in addition to like a family photo album, this exhibition feels also like a love letter to teachers, because it's really emphasizing the impact that teachers can have. And I'm curious if you could speak to us about this lineage of arts educators.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize, that I would say I don't think kind of gets enough prominence in often in art history and art exhibitions is understanding that really, each artist has learned from someone or something, but more often than not also is a teacher and mentor in their own right. And so being able to understand the artist as the recipient of or embedded in a lineage or a tradition that they've benefited from, and which ultimately in many, if not most or all cases, are also contributing to. And so again, just sharing some of these images, these graphics that we developed, showing some of the relationships, really understanding how embedded so many of these teachers and students or artist educators are in this lineage. And I think really every community has a tradition and a lineage. It just requires doing the work of uncovering it and highlighting it. And I think that's what we really tried to do in the case of Washington. And we can I think appreciate this lineage and tradition maybe by looking at a particular institution or two in Washington D.C. that exemplify this. And there's no question that Howard University is a powerful example of a place that has been an incredible home to a lineage and tradition rooted in Washington, but which has had a national and international impact. The renowned and late art historian and artist David C. Driscoll, who was both a graduate of Howard University and taught there, and had been chair of the art department in the 1960s, said, that Howard was the Mecca. It was the ultimate place that a Black artist could teach. And really speaks to the extent to which Howard became a national center for arts education. There were, I would say, 4 really foundational faculty members there. James V. Herring on the left was the founder of Howard's art department. He established the art department in 1921, and when he did, it became the first art department at any historically Black college or university in the country. And in the years that followed, he hired 3 artists who each taught at Howard for, in some cases, 40 years, in some cases, almost 50 years. And so on the far right is James A. Porter, who I mentioned in passing earlier, but he was a graduate of DC's Armstrong High School. He was a graduate of Howard, and actually immediately upon his graduation from Howard in 1927, James V. Herring hired him to teach in the art department. Second from right is James L. Wells, who was a master printmaker already. When he was hired in 1930, was already quite well known as a printmaker, particularly of the Harlem Renaissance. And then second from left is Lois Mailou Jones, who was a graduate of the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and was a painter and someone who taught at Howard for almost 50 years. And so between the 3 or 4 of them, taught thousands of students, many of whom went on to not only have really incredible careers of their own, but also lifetimes of lifetime of dedication to arts education. So here I'll share a short clip from the film that we produced for the Howard University section of the exhibition, in which you can hear the renowned artist and educator Sylvia Snowden, who is a 2-time graduate of Howard, got both her BFA and MFA from Howard, talking about the influence that her time at Howard had on her.
From Howard in 1965, and at Howard I had the best experience, and I think the best education that anyone could have. I mean, I had James A. Porter, James Wells, James L. Wells, Lois Mailou Jones, Lila Asher, and David Driscoll. Now, those people really instilled in us an appreciation and a duty to your craft, to honor your craft, and to be the best that you could. And it really, they elevated us from just a mere craft to, oh, we are elevated. We are artists, and we must always, always respect that. We just found out we were mere kids after we graduated, you know. And as far as these people were not only teachers, they were people who were pursuing their own careers in the visual arts, and they're very, very good at it, very good at it. And what they did was honor. The way they taught the kids, the students, was with honor. The way they treated their work was with honor. They didn't look upon it as wasteful, not wasteful. And that was a good time to be educated in art, a very good time. And I've taught in a lot of places. And I have never taught in a place where, in this country and in other countries, where there were more dedicated teachers from Howard.
So I think she captures it far better than I could. But just to share another example, really an exemplar of this tradition that and lineage that we've been talking about, Alma Thomas is a great example. She's someone, as I mentioned, was a graduate of DC's Armstrong High School, a graduate of the Minor Teachers College, or at the time was called Minor Normal School, and was actually the first graduate of Howard's art department in 1924, exactly 100 years ago. She went on to teach art at Shaw Junior High School in Washington for 35 years, and really was known as a deeply dedicated teacher, and ended up educating and influencing generations of young people and inspiring a love of the arts in generations of young people. She said of her mentor, James E. Herring, who, as I mentioned already, was founder of the art department at Howard, that he was the mentor who started and encouraged me in my art career. He was a great humanitarian who not only encouraged his gifted students, but also took a personal interest in their struggles to raise themselves above their handicaps. And, this was something that she herself, drawing on the model of one of her mentors, James Herring, practiced in her own lifetime, by all accounts. And so, this was something a tradition that she was educated into, and one that she, throughout her lifetime, even after retiring from the DC Public Schools, really was committed to. And so you can see on the left-hand side from her senior yearbook at Howard University, and on the right side, this photograph showing James V. Herring, who was second from the left, and three of his former students, David Driscoll, who went on to become a renowned art historian and artist, taught at Howard, taught at Fisk University, and then taught at University of Maryland for many years, where there's now the David Driscoll Center. Alma Thomas, second from right, and then Albert Carter, who was the curator of the Howard Gallery of Art. So in looking at the lineage in Washington, here's just one example, sort of one thread in that lineage. I mentioned already, we've talked about Thomas W. Hunster. He personally taught Alma Thomas when she was a student at Minor Normal School. I mentioned that Alma Thomas taught at Shaw Junior High for 35 years. One of her students, you can see a newspaper clipping from the 1930s of a young William Taylor, who went on to himself become a noted artist and art educator, known professionally as Bill Taylor, and who taught at Howard University. He taught at Corcoran School of the Art, University of the District of Columbia. And so just in these three educators, you can see more than a century of lineage of artist educators in Washington. The other institution I'll mention briefly is the Duke Ellington School of the Arts, which this year is celebrating its 50th anniversary. It was established in 1974, but was really begun in the late 60s as an organization called the Workshop for Careers in the Arts, or Workshops for Careers in the Arts, by Peggy Cooper Capeforts, who was a longtime art advocate and art collector, and Mike Malone, who was a theater director and choreographer. And they had this idea of creating a public high school that could train young people in the arts, provide a pre-professional arts training and a college prep curriculum. And many of the artists that are featured in the exhibition, in different sections of the exhibition, taught at this school, which in the years since its founding has had just an indelible impact. Here you can see the Everyman Street Theater Company that actually brought young people, trained them in the theater, and then also had them perform in neighborhoods across the city, actually in the streets. And then thinking about the continuing legacy, that Duke Ellington School of the Arts really was the culmination of this century of Black arts education history that the exhibition explores. Here you can see a couple of well-known alumni, Hank Willis Thomas, the conceptual artist, Dave Chappelle, and then Lois Maylor Jones, who taught at Howard for nearly 50 years. There she is lecturing at Ellington High School in the 1980s, really just coming full circle, showing the ways that this was a lineage and tradition of really intergenerational relationships that helped make Washington an unparalleled center for Black arts education.
Samir, I'm thinking about you as part of the lineage too, right? Like looking at Thomas W. Hunster's work at the World's Fair and hearing about how he invited his community of learners in and invited them to tell stories through dioramas, and then your invitation of a community in to tell stories in a variety of ways in your exhibition. One of the things that may not be as easy to tell from the slides is that you used so many different kinds of media to tell stories in the exhibition. And knowing that we have only 3 minutes left, can you give us like your elevator pitch version? How do you decide which medium to use when telling a story?
Yeah, well, I think for us the key is really using multiple media. You know, that throughout the exhibition there's artworks, right? And so artwork can tell one kind of story and provide one kind of window onto the history. But then, as I mentioned, we produced short films that are featured throughout the exhibition. So hearing and seeing people talk about that history helps bring it to life in a different way. There's photographs throughout the exhibition, which also help give people a sense of that history, help bring it to life. There's artifacts of all objects of all kinds. So everything from marionettes that students and teachers made in the 1930s in Washington, D.C., or Alma Thomas's paintbrushes and watercolor set, or a drum that was used at the New Thing Art and Architecture Center to teach African drum and dance. Just using as wide a range as possible of media so that anyone can have kind of a point of entry into this history, find a way to appreciate this history. And so, yeah, whether it's audio-visual, whether it's tactile, whether it's, really just trying to find as many points of entry, many ways to tell the story as possible can help bring it to life and can help people connect with it.
It's beautiful. And you've answered a question that was put into the chat about scaffolding for younger visitors. So there's lots of ways to interact with this content in the exhibition. Just turning things back as like a closing think for the teachers in the room. Think about how you might invite your students into the creation of an exhibition that unpacks these big ideas. And Samir's actually provided us with some materials that can support that. The last question, this chapter 5, is just a really quick think about what do we gain from thinking about our communities as part of making history together. So thinking of ourselves and the people around us as participant in the making of history. Why does that matter to us? Why does that matter in the world? Promised many times the link to that Learning Lab collection. Our incredibly able chat monitor, Melanie, is going to drop that into the chat. You could also scan this QR code with your phone if you like. And we wanted to just close with a reminder that we can all be history makers in our own ways and in our own communities. When we collaborate with our community, it requires a commitment to honoring the history and uncovering the stories that matter to them. So thank you for doing that for us today, Samir. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you, Elizabeth.